All right, so this is everything that we've been building up to this point. All the blockchain functionality, the smart contracts, the interactions between the smart contracts, and then the full test suite is all set up essentially for our front end so that we can actually have this working so that our customers can come online and have a UI where they can be depositing into our decentralized banking system, right? So this is what we are going to be building, and as you can notice as well, we've added a fun little particle animation here, which is from a library that I love. So we're also going to have a little bit of fun too, but of course, something like the animation you can just skip through if you're only interested in the functionality. That's just a little extra. I think it's very important to go the extra mile with UI, but of course that's for full stack development, and we are focusing primarily on applications. So the UI is important, and how we want to work on the front end versus the wiring with blockchain and with the data that we're doing. Of course, all that matters too and is relevant. But to what extent you want to go and get the graphics looking, well, that's all up to you. That's, this isn't a course on graphics, but I did want to add this fun interactive particles in the background. But anyway, back to the real functionality here and the exciting stuff that we've been building. So the first thing I'd like for you to notice is in the nav bar, we see an account number up over here. And if I just zoom in so you can see it better, we see that this account number on the top right top right end ends with a 11E87A0. Here, I'll highlight it. Now, if we go back to our Ganache, we're going to see on Ganache, if we check the second account, which if you remember, when we've been iterating and we've said time and time again, the first account is going to be the owner address and the second account is going to be the account of the customer for what we're building. And if you look over here, we're going to see the last matching digits. I'm not going to read the whole thing, right? But 11E87A0, that is a match. So very exciting. We actually get to implement the display of the account number on the top, and we're going to do that with React. We see that we can deposit our tokens, so we have our tether here, and we can withdraw. We see that we actually get the balance of 100 tokens to begin with. Now, this is very important as well, right? We've written tests for this. We set the deployment up in our migration so that automatically when our customers access this component, this part of our application, they actually get the 100 balance to start. That gets sent over to their account. We did this in our migration and we did this in our tests and it was working. We even did Truffle console tests to see that these balances were there and available. So we did manual tests on top of it. Everything checked out, and now we can actually see the balance being displayed. And so we're able to deposit, we're able to withdraw, and we're going to be able to receive an airdrop, or our customers will be able to receive airdrops that we can set, up so that, let's say, after every 50 tokens that they stake, they get an airdrop. And that's the kind of functionality that you can then extend on your own as an exercise and work off of and continue to build and develop. I hope you do. Of course, it's totally up to you. So I just wanted to show you before we get going to hopefully get you excited, get you motivated. You've worked really hard to get to this point, and now we can see, a cool and basic setup, but that has all the fundamentals when it comes to yield farming, all the fundamental functionalities for blockchain right here. So I'm excited to get going on this. I think it's very helpful to actually have a visual sense a visual sense of the final version of what we want to do as we're going to build each part consecutively. Of course, in the real world, you're not going to have it, let's say, exactly a final version, but you can do a mock-up. You could always have some kind of model, or you can even sketch something out. That's always helpful in terms of understanding how you want the user experience to be. Okay, so enough with the chit chat. Let's get this coding party started. I'll see you in the next video. All right, so we have effectively made a nav bar. If you remember, we made our nav bar. We did some styling to it, which now actually shows the account number. If I go into our thingy-mabingy, all right, so there's the account number. And it's got some style action. We made a main app, our main app component, which is grabbing our contracts, very important. It's running some state. It's doing some logic for the contracts, setting them up to state, and running props so that we can send this information around to different components and update the information as it changes. And then we render our nav bar effectively for the moment. So the next thing that we should build is another component, and we want this component to be the main component. And the reason why we're going to do this is we want to effectively keep some logic contained in main and then other logic away from main. There's a few good reasons to do this. One, it's good to compartmentalize anyway. It's good to create these components and have strict and create pools of functionality that work with each other. And also, and another good reason, which is kind of has to do with that as well, is when you do this, then this allows us this ability to be flexible with our functions, to be flexible with our components, with our features. So we're going to be by creating a main component and putting in the main component our buttons, our form to deposit, to withdraw, including our staking balance. We can then use this loading. We can then work with our loading state here. Say while the page is loading, we can have a prompt that lets people know that the page is loading, that all the main information is loading, and then once it's loaded, we can display the main. So by separating it, we can do this in a really efficient way. And if that's not making sense, don't worry, we're gonna do it together now, so don't worry about that. We're gonna go through it. But let's get started. Here on building this main component. The first thing we're going to do is get rid of this text center because we're not doing that. And we're going to get rid of these H1s. So let's delete this. This is where we're going to put our main component in here. So it doesn't exist yet, but we can just write it in main like this. This is how we're going to be bringing it in. Okay, doesn't exist yet. And let's also change the center thing. We don't need this. So instead of text center, we're going to create a container. We're going to make the container fluid. So there's just some styling, and we're going to make it MT5. And if you're wondering how I know what container fluid is in MT5, well, you can actually look up what these are just coming from React style that comes in from their global. These are just coming in from the global style that we have. Container fluid is actually from Bootstrap, so if you want to learn more about what you could do, you can look up React Bootstrap and check out if you want to get deeper into the styling. But this is just some basic styling just to make our app a little bit more pretty looking. And underneath the container, we're going to make our container here, and we're going to make another class name. We're going to set this to row, and inside of here, bring in a main style div. All right, so we actually have a main that's going to give us access to main parameters, and the type of parameters we can bring in are the role, for example, role, and we're going to set the role to main. We're going to have some more class style here. We're going to do col-large.12 and ml-auto and Mr-auto. Okay. And then we're going to add a style as well. We're going to do max width to 600 pixels, and this needs to be strings. And we're also going to have a max height. We're going to do a min height, which is going to be 100 VM. And I'm going to explain what this is in just a second. So minimum height, max width. Okay, so main role, like we said, is we're accessing main, and then through that we can have the parameter of main. And then in class name here, we're adding basically we're doing a large 12 for the columns. And then for the style over here, we're saying that the maximum width possible should be 600 pixels, but it should have a minimum height of 100 VM. And 100 VM is basically the entire view. So we're talking about 100% when we say 100 VM. And this is done in pixels. That's why we put the PX. It's just some basic styles. I don't want to get so deep into it because this is not a course on styling. I just want it to look decent. That's all. So since it's CSS essentially, if you are curious to learn more, I encourage you to just look these up and see if you can find your own kind of stylings that you would like to play with it. You know, it's its own world when it comes to styling. It's its own separate world. I'm more interested in functionality, but I like things to look good too. And okay, and so in our main, we're going to create one more div. And what are we going to put in this div? Well, actually, we're going to move our main out of here. Ugh, oops. And we're going to put our main in here in the div, right? Because that's why we created this. So let me actually bring this down. Okay, so what do we do exactly? Well, we just created some more divs. We created a container, which is basically going to contain our main. And then we did some stylization for some divs inside of it. So we're kind of creating a box here. And we're making it fluid. And what is MT? 5? Well, that means the margin to the top is 5. So we're giving our box 5 px margin to the top. So it has some nice spacing. We add row for the class name. Then in our main, we bring in the role and we make it main. And ML is margin to the left, and we want that to be automatic. MR is margin to the right. We also want that to be automatic. This is just our columns. We want that to be 12. And you'll see why, because we could play with these numbers once I have it all up. But this is all prefix. I already know this. I'm not just making this up out of thin air. I've already built this. So I had to play around with all this to get it right, to get it how I want it to be. And then this is to actually set our container with our max width and our minimum height, okay? Okay, so it's okay if this doesn't really make sense, because the thing is that if we save now and then we load, first of all, it's going to fail to compile because main doesn't exist. So actually, let's just go ahead and make this main component. So what we're going to do is go into components and make a new folder. We're going to call it main.js. And now we're going to import in our app.js the main, even though it's nothing yet. So we're just going to say import main from main.js. Let's save that. Now let's go back to our local host. It says it can't resolve main. Of course it can't, because I'm not exporting anything from main yet. So it's just empty. So let's go ahead and says can't resolve main. So why isn't it resolving it? Okay, so I actually made a folder by accident. So don't do that. Delete a folder if you made a folder. We want to make a file in components called main.js. All right, let's save. Let's go back. All right, and of course it's going to crash it because there's nothing really in there. So I have to get rid of the main. Okay, so it's working. All right, so let's put the main back. It's going to crash because it's not actually importing anything yet, but we can just fix that. So if we just go to main.js, now in main.js, this is where we're going to actually build our card, okay? So if you remember, this is where we're going to be building our buttons and our staking, our depositing, our withdrawing, and our balance. And I don't want to show you the final page again because I want you to actually just visualize it. I could load it up very easily, but I don't want to do that. I want you to challenge your imagination. I want to challenge your ability to visualize the future. You need to be able to visualize the steps ahead. That's what's going to make you a better programmer. Okay, a better engineer in general. All right. So to build up the main, let's do the same thing that we've been doing thus far with everything else. We could actually go to the nav bar and just copy everything. Go to main and paste. And let's call this, okay, we can get rid of the bank. We don't need that. We're going to change the name from class navbar to class main. We're going to export default main. And we're going to get rid of everything in here in the return over here. We'll just add a div because we need to have a div in there because it has to return something. Okay, so let's save this. And now if we go to app.js, we should have the main in there and it shouldn't be crashing anymore. So if we go back to our local host, Yeah, okay, so we're not crashing anymore. That's good. Very, very good. Okay, so we're not going to build out now. Okay, so let's just build out the shell. Let's just build out the basic user interface for the main so we can have that. So let's do that together now. Okay, so for our div, we're going to add an ID of content. And we're going to do an MT, margin to the top. Sorry, class name equals, we're going to do MT. I did 3. Okay. And again, you know, this is stuff that I already know because I've done it before. That's how I'm coming up with all this stuff. This is margin to the top. And then what do we want to do in here? Well, we want to have a table, essentially. It's going to be a table that's going to hold the information for our staking, our balance, and our buttons. So we can just do that by bringing in a table, HTML style. And then we have access to more JSX in this. We can actually have TR. So we're going to have a TR. Oops. To our table row. And then we're going to have TH. We can make 2 THs. And then we can have 2 THs inside of here. And then, so our TH are our table cells. And you know what? We're going to wrap these rows around a table head. So our header. So we're going to do a T head like that. All right. And then after our head, we're going to have a body. So we're going to have a T body, just like that. We're going to have another T row. And then we're going to have some TDs as well. So we're going to do TD. And TD is just the table data cells. These are just really the semantics to make minor differences for when we're building our table so we can be more specific with our styling and the way we want to design. Overall design the user interface and the experience for the table. Okay, so this is our table and it's empty right now. So let's go ahead and put some stuff into our table, right? So we can bring in class name, and from our Bootstrap here we got table. We're going to do text will be muted and text will be center. So we're going to center the text and we're bringing in this table and we are just adding some style over here. So that's it. For the rows, we're going to have some writing. So we have to remember that the table is going to be dark. So we remember that we're going to be using this darker background. So we want to have a nice white text font. So we're just going to do a style. Color is going to be white. Now in our TH, we can actually access the parameters scope. And we can add some more styling for the scope of our column here. This is in our table cells, and we're going to do that as well as here. And we're going to write staking balance, right? Because we're going to want to have our staking balance. And we're going to have our reward balance. And for our body, we're going to do the same thing. So we'll take this color white, we'll copy it and paste it over here. And what are we going to keep in our body? Well, we're going to have our staking balance, reward balance at the head. And then in the body, I think what we want to have is our USDT, our Tether token balance, right? So we want the USDT, and then we want the rewards, and we can just write this as RWD, right? So this is for the... Okay, so let's just save this for a second, and let's refresh. Okay. And right now, because our background is white, we can't actually see because I've actually made the font color white. But if you highlight, if you hold down your mouse and you click, you're going to see staking balance, reward balance, USD, and RWT. And we actually see we've got the lines here for our rows and from our table kind of set up here. We've got it centered, entered. So we see the styling is starting to come together. I guess for the time being, it doesn't have to be white. If you want to be able to see it, we can switch the color here to black. And then if we go back, there, see staking balance, reward balance. So we've got our nav bar on the top, the account number, staking balance in USDT, reward balance is going to display in RWD here. Okay, good. So we're making some progress. The important thing is that things are displaying correctly. Let's finish up the main component skeleton layout together. So let's go back. And after our table, basically what we want to do is below the table, we want to have a form where you can type in how much. So you have an input box where you can type in essentially how many tokens you want to stake, how many you want to deposit, and then you can deposit those tokens. And deposit those tokens, you can see your balance, and you can also unstake. You can withdraw from the bank. All right, so we're going to need to build a form for that. So let's do that actually in the next video. Okay, take a minute, have a coffee, relax, read a book, or just jump straight in to the next video. Bye-bye. Okay, so let's continue finalizing the skeletal build of our main component here. So we've got a table, and we're going to build a form now, essentially. And just before we continue, I realized you might be a little bit confused about the styling still, because I know we're calling these class names, but there's no CSS file. But we are using Bootstrap, right? And if you remember in our package JSON, and we look at our dependencies, we bring in Bootstrap. And we have React Bootstrap here, and we have Bootstrap. And if we go to our index.js, which is essentially where we're, which is essentially how we're getting React to render onto the DOM, we'll see the things that we're importing, the important things. So we import the app, right? That's how we get the app to render. We have a service worker, which is doing stuff under the hood. We don't have to worry about that. And we see we've got React DOM, right? This is how we render it. We bring in React DOM, and then we say React DOM.render, and we render what we want. Here it's the app, because that's our main source, as we discussed. And then we always say document.getElement by ID to the root, okay? And this is straight up JavaScript running it by the document getElement by root. For those of you who've done web development for a while will recognize getElement by ID, okay? And that's how we set up React. That's how it actually works. But what I want to draw your attention to is actually the Bootstrap. So we are importing Bootstrap as well. And by importing it here, it actually applies to importing it everywhere. So that's how we're able to just bring in all of, that's how we're able to just access all of this Bootstrap stuff. So it's not magic. I just wanted to show you that none of this is magic. React doesn't happen magically. Bootstrap doesn't happen magically. Making the app the source doesn't happen magically. It's all scripts, right? These are all scripts that are tied together. Okay, so let's continue forward and build out our form. So let's make a div here where we're going to put our form in. We're going to have a class name. We're going to do card, and we're going to add a padding MB2 over here, and we're going to change the opacity a little bit. So I'm going to do style. You're going to see why this looks better later on. Opacity, I'm going to go 0.9. Okay. And again, you know, like I don't want to get too deep in it. Essentially, opacity can change the transparency of what we're looking at based on what it's overlapping. So this is based on 100% ratio. So 0.9 will be 90% overlapping, whereas 0.1 will be just 10%. Anyway, you don't have to know so much about that. Really, not for blockchain. Really, not right now in this course. But you can look into it. And we're going to see it in action soon. So I'll show you more once it's up and running. And in here, we're going to create a form where we're going to have our onSubmit button. And that's it for now. We'll just do a form, and we'll give it a class name for padding of 3. And we're going to make another div in here. And we're going to have a style. Style equals border spacing 0, 1 EM. And again, this isn't out of thin air. I've done this before, so I'm just putting back, you know, I had to work on it to come up with the dimensions here to get them how I wanted to. So that's how I'm writing this out. And now we're going to add some labels in our forms because we can bring in labels. So we're going to say label over here. And we're going to have a class name. Float. We're going to float it to the left. It's going to have a style as well. We're going to say margin. No, we're going to do border spacing. Actually, you know, we're going to do margin to the left, 15 pixels. Okay, and then we're going to make it bold. So we're going to bring in B like that. So we can bold in it. And what are we going to write here? Well, this is our label. This is going to be our label for our label to stake tokens. So we're just going to write stake tokens. Okay, so there it is. Okay, and then under our label, we're going to make a span. Okay, and our span is also going to float to the left, and we're going to have a style as well. And it's going to be a margin to the left of, we'll do 8 pixels. Sorry, we're floating this to the right. Margin to the right. And what's this going to be? This is going to be our balance, right? That's why we're floating this to the left and we're floating this to the right. So just so you can visualize this, maybe it can make sense to you here. Essentially what we're doing, or we're saying here, is that we're going to have a form, and then basically the form is going to be wrapped as a card. So we put the form in this div, right? The form has this spacing, it's got some border spacing. Now in the form we have a label. All the way on the left side, it's going to say stake tokens. That's where we're going to be staking our tokens, right? So we're going to have an input box there where we can say how much we want. We didn't create that yet, but we're going to. And that's going to go all the way to the left. That's why we float to the left, okay? And that's a way of actually positioning with CSS. It's a style so we can position all the way to the left. And then we do the same thing for our balance, but we don't want that on the left side. We want it on the right side. So that's why we float it to the right. Okay. If I actually save this right now and we go to our dApp, look at that. Okay. So now we see stake tokens on the left and our balance on the right, and they all exist within this card, right? They all exist within this card. So what do you think is going to happen if I actually remove this float to the right? What do you think is going to happen? So I go back. Well, we see that the balance is no longer floating to the right. It's no longer going to attach itself to the right side of this card. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. Hopefully you're seeing that. You could also see that the stake token is bold, right? Because we added bold. We moved it to the left. There's a bit of a margin. Hopefully you can see a little bit of a margin. It doesn't start right here. It starts over here. And the same thing with the balance. It also has a margin, which we can see when we bring back the float to the right. Okay, excellent. So hopefully the styling now is starting to, you're starting to understand why we're adding all this style. I know it doesn't look anything close to amazing right now, but these are just some foundations that we're laying down right now so that we could get it to where we need it to be afterwards. Okay, and now under our span, what do we want to have? Well, underneath our stake tokens, actually, let's take a look here. Now that we have this set up, let's take a look together at visualizing what it is we want to add to complete this. And again, I'm not gonna go to the final version because I want you to use your imagination. I want you to visualize this. So underneath the stake tokens, what we want to have, right, is we want a text box and in that text box, you can put the amount that you want to stake, right? And over here with our balance, we want to be able to show the balance, right? So that's where the balance is going to go. But that we're going to use state to do. This, we could actually create a text box, and then and then the state from our React is going to react to whatever the input is. So we want a text box in here, and then underneath there we want to have some buttons. We want to have a button that's going to deposit, if you remember, and then another button that's going to withdraw. Now, if this is really confusing or hard to imagine, you could always, of course, go back to the first video where I showed you what it is we're going to be building on the front end, like the completed version, and you can take a look at that, and maybe that'll help. But I do encourage you to just bear with me and just build it one component at a time, because in the real world, that's how you would be doing this, right? You would be building it one piece at a time, or you'd be working with a team environment, and they would just be building those pieces one at a time as well. Okay, so we want to have a text input under. So we do div, we're going to have a class name, input group, and MB will be 4. Okay. And then we're going to bring in an input. And the input is our text box. And input has certain parameters now that we can, has certain properties that we can now bring in. So we can bring in the type of our input to be what? A text, right? Whoopsies, type. And we're going to have a placeholder. And that's what we put inside of the text. And then we're going to make it required. So that just means that it's required that you have to actually, that in order to submit, in order to submit your form, this input is required for you to fill it out. So let's save that. Let's take a look. And there it is. So now we have a text input. Awesome. So I can type in here anything I want, and I can delete, and it always goes back to the placeholder, 0. Now it doesn't do anything just yet, but at least we're building the skeleton. So very good. Okay, and this input actually, we want to self-close it, right? So we're going to close it like this, since it's an input. We don't want to have an open input and a closed input. All right, now let's create some more divs underneath here, right? Because we need to have our buttons. So we're going to do another div underneath here, and we're going to do class name equals input grouped open, and we're going to add another div inside this div as well, because we're going to put an image in here, and this is going to be slightly different. What we're going to do is we're going to do input group text like that, and we're going to bring in our image source. We're going to bring in our tether image, which you can actually find. If you look down here, we should see a tether.png. There it is. So we're going to bring in this tether PNG over here so that we have the picture next to our USDT. So it's going to show the amount, and it's going to see it in USDT in our tether, and we're going to have the image that we're going to bring in. So it's going to look nice. And we can just add an alt, and we can say tether. Sorry, the alt doesn't go there. The alt would go, of course, it's a property that goes in our image over here. Make sure to close the image. And here we can actually add some spacing. So NBPS. Let's add a couple of these and write USDT. So that's where our tether USDT is. We're going to have to import this. So let's go up to the top and import tether from tether. Oops. We're going to have to get out of here. So we're going to go from here and then tether PNG. Okay, excellent. You can save that. Let's save that and take a look. Whoa, all right. So little issue over here. Size is very big. Let's fix that. Okay, so we're going to change the height here. So what are we going to do? We can just go, let's put the source first of all, because that looks better. Alt tether, and we can say height. Let's try 32. That's better. All right, this NBPS is not looking good. Sorry, it's and NBSP. I'm being a little dyslexic. Let's try that again. All right. Nice. Okay, so we have our stake tokens. We brought in our image, and it's set to USDT. Very good. All right, and now we're going to leave the input group here, and we're going to leave the second input group, and we're going to leave the third input group. And underneath here is where we're going to actually add another button, is where we're going to actually add our buttons. So let's do the first button. We do that just by bringing in a button like this. And we're going to have two buttons, right? So we're going to have one button for depositing and one button for withdrawing. So this can say deposit, and this can say withdraw. And we know that when we deposit, we're staking, and when we withdraw, we unstake, or our customers. And we're going to make this type a submit button. All right, so that's because we're going to have to submit this into the form. So that's why we make the type submit. Okay, so this essentially is going to submit the entire form. All right, and let's just add some styling, our favorite thing to do. I know, we're almost there. So for button, Bootstrap, we can say button primary. We can do button large. and we can turn it into a block button, block. Okay. And actually, the withdraw button is not going to be in our submit form. It's going to be separate, right? We want it to have separate functionality. So we're not going to put it into our form. We're going to put it after our form. So we'll just move it to outside of the form. Remember, this opens and this closes. All right, so let's do that. And this button is also going to have the same classes, the same style. So I'm going to copy the style for the withdraw button, the class name here, and I'm going to add it here. Okay, so let's go ahead and see how this is looking. So let's go back to our Firefox. Ooh, look at that. So now we have a deposit button and a withdraw button. Very nice. We've got our stake tokens. Now, of course, if we click on it, nothing's going to happen, except for because it is a submit button, it's going to be requiring for this input to be filled out. So if I do this and I hit submit, it's not going to do anything, right? It's actually going to kind of just crash and then restart because nothing's happening. And then we have our withdraw button, which does nothing, right? Because there's nothing. It's not going to do anything when we click on it. We actually see a response in the deposit because there is some state that's already built into the form. That's what's interesting about forms in React. So there is a reaction happening, but since it's not set up to the state essentially that we've created, it's not going to actually do anything, right? We did not tell it to do anything upon submit, but we are going to. We're getting there. We're getting there. We just have one more final addition to this form, one final addition to our main component, and we are done. So let's do that. So the final thing we're going to add is going to be our airdrop, right? So here for this airdrop, what we can do is just create one more div. And for the class name, we can just take what we've been doing, card body. Let's do text center. Let's do a style. Color is going to be blue. And we can just type in here airdrop like that for now. So let's go ahead and save that. And we see airdrop. And then eventually there's going to be a timer next to the airdrop so that after, if we want to stake over 50 tokens, this airdrop counter will go down. We'll build that out as well for bonus. And okay, there we go. So we have our cards set up. We have our staking balance, our reward balance. We have our stake tokens, which is in USDT, which is going to be done in Tether and USDT. And we have our balance. Okay, a couple things I just want to fix here. I realized that if we go back up here where we see border space, this should actually be border spacing. So let's change that. Okay, so that has nicer spacing now. And okay, that's good for now. It's not 100%, but it's very close to where we want it. We're going to add the animations later on, but we just wanted to give it enough kind of build right now so that we wanted to give it enough build right now so that we have the skeleton in place so we can add all of our inputs and our functionality afterwards. I always think it's best to write out the interface first, write out the skeleton, then add the functionality, and then add the functionality afterwards. So now that we have that component done, in the next video, let's get back to more fun stuff with JavaScript. Okay, I'll see you there. Okay, so that's been fun doing some styling and getting involved in the whole styling and laying things out. But let's get back to my more preferred thing to do, which is just anything related to JavaScript functionality specifically. So let's go back to, oh, wait, actually, before we do that, I saw that I made a mistake, another typo. Yes, I know, more typos. So in the main.js, in the class name, here, if you go down, you want to go back to the form. So go to the class name MB3. Go to your form in main, and then go down all the way to where you see the divs that we made under the input, where we have the type text, the placeholder. Okay, and underneath that, we created some divs with input, different types of input class, with different types of divs with class styling. And I wanted to write input group open, but I wrote grouped. So let's just correct that mistake. So let's make an input group instead of input grouped. And let's go to Firefox. Okay, and that's better. All right, and then next up, let's go into our app. And I also want to add in the render section of our app where we created a div that says class name row, next to it, I want to add content as well. So let's bring in content. Let's save that in the style. Actually, you know what? What am I even talking about? Just get rid of that content. That's not right. Okay, so we have our main component that's loading, and we have our navbar component that's loading. They're both loading on our main app, right? Which now we know goes into our index.js and then gets rendered onto the DOM. All right, that's how React works, not magic. So now what we want to do is, because we've created this main component and we separated it, and we separated its logic, what we can do actually is create a loader so that when we're loading, we don't actually, that when the page is actually loading, instead of seeing a blank screen, we can actually get a read for a loading. We can get a read for a loading, and only when we're done loading, then we can actually send over the main component. And that's good to know as well, because, and why else would that be good to have? Well, it's functionally important for what we're doing here, because if we load our contracts, because if we don't load all these contracts before our main gets loaded, then people use it, it's going to break. You know, we only want to load the main after we know that we've loaded everything else, that the contracts have been loaded. Then they get the function. So after the contracts have been loaded, then they get to use it, right? If it hasn't been loaded and they use it, that's not good. So we can actually prevent this from happening by creating this loading wall, all right? And it's just a good look, and it's just a good thing to have. So how do we do this? How do we write the logic for this? Well, we're already halfway there because we've created the loading state, and we set the loading state to false once these important contracts have been loaded, right? So what do we want to do after that? Well, all of our rendering happens in here, right? So we want to put the loading in here. So above render, what we're going to do is create a variable, and we're going to call it content, like this, okay? And before we return anything, we're going to set up a conditional statement. We're going to actually use a conditional operator. If we want to use JavaScript, what we do is we turn on the curly brackets, or sorry, we type in some curly brackets to load so that we can put our JavaScript in JSX, okay? And then what we can do in here is we can say this dot loading. Remember, we have to call it from this. So this dot loading, or sorry, this dot state dot loading. And what we're going to say is, if this dot state dot loading is true, then we're going to create a paragraph, which is going to take an ID of loader. Okay. Text is going to be center, and oops, we got to put that inside. Text center, and we're going to have a style here, and we're going to create a margin of 30 pixels. Okay, and then what are we going to write here for our paragraph? Well, we want to write loading, please, ... And so this is like an if statement. What's great about this operator is that it's basically a this or that type of functionality, which works perfectly for something like loading, because essentially, for something like loading this, because essentially all we really want to say here is if the state of loading is true, if the state is set to true, load this text that says loading, please. Sorry, then display this text that says loading, please. Now, if it's not true, what we do is we use a semicolon. Sorry, we use a colon. So we use a question mark to say, well, then do this. And then we use the colon to say, well, if that's not true, then do that. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to set our variable content to equal main. Okay. And okay, first of all, it's maybe hard to kind of read all that all the way out. So let's do some indentation so you can read it better. So we'll put the class name here. Maybe you can see this better. Actually, here, let's load it like that. So, and we'll put the style like that. Okay, I just You may be thinking, well, you just put it exactly back to how you had it. All right, let's try it like this. Let's go through this one more time. So what are we saying exactly? What we're saying is that we create a variable called content. Then we create a conditional statement here that says, that basically checks to see if we're loading, if the loading is set to true. If the loading is set to true, then we basically just have this loader. Then we have a text that says loading please. And if it's not true, then we just load the main. Okay? So we wait. So because of this, now we get to wait for all these contracts to load before we give permission to our customers to use it. That way it's not going to break because we have to get the network patched in first. All right. Okay. So that's a lot to kind of grasp one after another, but hopefully that's making a bit of sense. Let's just save this and see what happens. So I'm going to go into Firefox and we're getting an error that says 87 assignment function call saw an expression. So let's go take a look. Okay. So, I forgot to actually include what we're doing, what this is going to be. Because right now this doesn't work because we're just saying if state.loading is true, then randomly there's this p paragraph, this thing that exists, but it's not set to anything. So what we want to do is actually set this to the content. So I didn't actually complete the code correctly here. So I want to say content equals. So let's save this, try again. Go back. Okay, great. And now we see that it's not breaking. But is it actually loading? Well, I don't see any loading thing. Do you? When I refresh it? No, nothing. So why is that? Well, let's go back to our code. So the reason why it's not actually loading right now is because we never actually switched our main to our content, right? If you look here, we create this variable content and we say, okay, if it's loading, then, then send this message loading, please. Otherwise, just, load the main. But what are we actually rendering? We're not rendering the content. We're always rendering the main no matter what. So how do we fix this? Well, if you said, let's take the content and put it in here, but you forgot to use JSX, well, you're close. But if you said, let's put the content here and add the JSX curly brackets because it's JavaScript, and we save this now, then you are a rock star. So let's give this a shot. Hold on a second. Let's refresh. Did you see it? Should we do it again? Did you see it that time? I'm zooming in. Let's do it again. There it is. Okay, okay, amazing. So we've got our loading functionality to work. Hopefully you understand why this functionality is so important for the application and how this functionality is beneficial in general. This is something that can be used for many different things. So loading is something that you can see a lot of in applications. Therefore, you see a lot of it in applications, in both. So hopefully there's some good takeaways here for you. And I hope you enjoyed that. That's it on the loading. In the next video, let's actually finally start passing in our contract information, the staking information, everything into our main component so that we can actually start depositing and withdrawing. Okay, very exciting stuff. Great work getting through this. Great work making it this far, and I'll see you in the next video. All right, so now that we've got our loading working, we set up all the shells for components, and we've got our state set up, meaning that we've loaded our contract into our state. Let's send the properties, let's send our props of our state over into our, where is it? Into our, here it is, into our main component, right? So we want to get, essentially, we want to get, to send our balances over. So we want to send our tether balance over, reward balance over, and our staking balance over into main. So how do we do that? Well, it's as easy as just passing it into main, passing the state over into main, and just defining what the properties are going to be, and then passing it in. So how do we do that? Well, we can just do tether balance like this is going to equal what, do you think? Well, it's going to be this dot state dot tether balance, right? And so that's how we set that one. And then we're going to do the same for all of them. So reward balance is going to be this dot state dot reward balance, and staking balance is going to equal this dot state dot staking balance. All right. So now we have now we're sending our properties into the main. So if we go into our main.js, we should now be able to access those properties. Excellent. Now to see if we're receiving the staking balance, what we can do is we can go into our main, and in our render, we can actually console log the staking balance. So we can say console.log this.state.staking balance. Sorry, not state, right? We're going to be calling it through props. It's a property. So we do this.props.staking balance. And if I save this now and go into our Firefox, we see that currently we are staking 0, right? And that makes sense, right? Because we are currently not staking anything. And if we want to change that, we can try the other balances as well. So if we try tether balance, save that, we see that we have our tether balance, which is 1 million, right? That's how many tokens that we have that's how many tokens that are available in the tether balance. And if we did the rewards, we would see that as well. So it looks like the props are being passed successfully. Excellent. So where do we actually want to show the staking balance and the RWT balance? Well, we want to show it over here, right, where we see USDT and RWDT in our table. So this is where we actually want to show. So this is actually where we want to show what the balances are. So how do we do that? Well, we can actually bring it in with props, right? Just how we did in console log, only this time we'll make it visible in the table cell. So we can do this dot props dot, which one for USDT would be tether. Sorry, not tether. This is actually going to show what our staking balance is. So this dot props dot staking balance, right? And the rewards, we're going to want to show how many rewards we have. So we're going to do this dot props dot reward RWD balance. Okay, let's save that. Let's give it a shot. Okay, and we see that we're currently staking 0 and we have 0 rewards. And that's true, right? I mean, and that would be correct, right? I mean, so far we're not staking anything and we have no rewards. So far it makes sense. All right, let's go back. And the other thing is that we want this in Ether. So why don't we just write Ether like this and Ether here as well. Okay. And you know what? Let's add some space. So we have a little bit of space here. And you know what? This is going to be in Ether, and we want to convert it. So in order to convert it, we got to bring in our good friend Web3. So let's do that. Let's do web3.utils, and we're going to go from way and convert it like this. And remember, we have to say it's going to be Ether. And let's do the same thing over here. And it's also going to be Ether. Okay. And actually, we don't have Web3 here. We're going to be grabbing it from the window. So we're going to do it like this, window.web3. Convert it like that. Okay, so window.web3 utils there. Okay. Okay, great. So we've done the rewards. We've done the staking balance. What about the tether balance? Well, that would be under our balance over here, right? So this would be the same thing, except for this would be the tether balance. So we can literally copy this over here, put a space, but instead of reward balance, we're going to write tether balance like this. All right, let's save that. Now let's go back. And would you look at that? Okay, this is very cool, because now this is very cool, and this is giving us a better type of confirmation too, because 0 is always a little ambiguous. But now we see that we are receiving the 100 tether tokens as our balance. So the state is showing up. That is awesome. You should be excited about that, about noticing that the 100 is there. That means that this is working. If it's not showing up, that means that there's an issue in the code. Go back, try to find out what it is, or check the final solution. But if you've been coding along exactly for line, then you should be seeing the balance at 100 right now, staking balance 0, reward balance at 0. Okay. So the final thing to really do here is to get these buttons to work, right? We want to be able to input something in the text field here in the input and then deposit that amount. Of course, it has to be within the 100, but that's the whole thing. We want to be able to put 6 and be able to deposit that 6 and then withdraw it, right? So in the next video, let's go ahead and actually fill out the form information, get the state working in our forms so our buttons can work. And after we do that, and we get it to work, we're going to be effectively finished the Dapplication functionality, like totally done. Mind-blowing. Okay, very exciting. I'll see you in the next video. All right, so up to this point now, we pretty much have loaded all our contracts. We have all our components laid out, at least in terms of UI. Everything is working, except for the most important thing, which essentially is the depositing and the withdrawing, i.e. the staking and the unstaking, right? So we want to be able to put in the amount here and then deposit that amount and withdraw that amount and see the balance change accordingly, the staking balance. And the reward balance is when we want to issue rewards. We want to see that change as well, right? So how do we do that exactly? Well, in our main component, what we want to do is actually add arguments here, or add functionality into our form, where we can actually, so that when we submit, we're changing these things. We are going to execute a function that's going to grab what exactly? Well, we're going to want to grab our deposit tokens function from the contract from our deposit tokens over here. So we want to be able to deposit, right, when we deposit. So we want to execute this. And when we withdraw, when we unstake, we want to execute this, the unstake token. So that's essentially it. So how do we do that? Well, what we need to do actually is, back in our app.js, we need to create 2 new functions, essentially. We need to create the logic so that we can grab those functions from that contract and set up the functionality here. And we're going to do this in our main app because this is where we've been grabbing all of our contract information so far. And this is where we keep the state for our contract information. So it just, architecturally speaking, it makes a lot of sense to just keep it all over here, right? So let's just write this out, right? Because this is going to be a little bit complicated. And so I just want to kind of have this fleshed out. So we're going to make 2 functions, one that stakes and one that unstakes, right? We're going to leverage our functions that we already created in our decentral bank contract, which is the deposit tokens and the, what's the other one? And the unstaking, right? And we know that, and let's just think about each function. So the staking function, right? What's the staking function going to take? Well, the staking function, what it's going to do essentially, what we want it to do is we want it to access the decentral bank deposit tokens, and then essentially send the transaction over. So send the transaction hash and get that done, right? And in order to do this, we also know that the deposit tokens is a transfer from functionality call that comes from our, if we go to our deposit tokens, it's a transfer from our tether, right? And we know that the transfer from here has to takes an allowance and emits the transfer. And we know that for third parties, party transfers with the transfer from, we also need to run an approval. So we're going to want to have an approval. We're going to want to run the, so we're also going to want to run the function to approve the transaction before we can actually do the deposit tokens. And all this is going to be for the stake token, right? So all of this is for the staking. All right, so that's essentially what we need to do. I just wanted to flesh it out because it's important for you. It's important for me, for anyone, for me writing this, for us writing it together, to visualize what we're doing, to understand what we're writing. That's going to make us That's just going to make us better at coding, programming in general. So let's go ahead and do it. So we want to say staking function here. I'm going to make it over the constructor. And essentially, we're going to do this function. It's going to be called stake tokens. Okay. And we're going to do an arrow function. And it's going to take an argument. And that argument's going to be what? Well, it's going to be the amount, right? Because it can be anywhere between 0 to 100. So we're going to have this amount. And so let's actually just write out the deposit. Remember, what we want to do is grab from the Decentralized bank the deposit tokens function, and we want to do that from the account, from this account, to deposit it and send that as a transaction, right? So how do we even write all that? Well, the good news is that we have our Decentralized bank in our state, so we can just do this dot state Decentralized bank. Okay. And what are we going to grab from that? Well, we want the deposit tokens, right? And what are we grabbing from the deposit tokens? Well, we want the amount. And now we're going to send that. So we do dot send to send it. And here we can actually specify where we're sending it from. So we're going to say from, where do we want to send that from? Well, from this account, right? So this dot state dot account. We also have that in our state. Pretty awesome. And now what we do to run the transaction is we do dot on, and we can say transaction hash like this, and this should be in a string because it's going to read it in string format, and we can run hash like this. Run hash, and that's going to do it for us. But we also want to change probably our loading state, right? Because after this, our loading state is going to be finished loading. So let's set our state of our loading in here to false. And that means actually that every time we run this function, we're going to want to set our loading to true, right? Because every time we run the stake tokens, we want to reset the loading to true until it's finished running the function. Then we set it back to false. So I'm going to move it back in here as true. Okay, so this is just how we write out the transaction. But let's go over this. So essentially what we're doing is we're grabbing the Decentralized bank, which is in our state already, the contract that we have. And then we grab the deposit tokens, right? That's the deposit tokens function. And we set it up to the amount. And that amount is the input amount. And we send that over from the state of the account. So that's the account state. That's our current, the account that the customer has. And that's the transaction that gets processed. Now, oops, sorry, this should actually be as an argument. So we're going to change hash into parentheses like that. So change hash. So add parentheses around hash. And the other thing is this isn't actually going to work, right? And we know why, right? Because this needs to be approved first. Otherwise, it's going to hit an error. So how do we approve it? Well, we have to approve it from our approve function. And where's our approve function? Well, it's in the tether contract. So we actually need to switch. So what we want to do is we want to say this.state.tether.approve. If you remember, in our approve function in our tether contract, the approve takes an address, which is a spender, and an integer, which is value. All right, so what's going to be the address? Well, we want the address to be the Decentralized bank address, right? We need to approve the Decentralized bank address. So to do that, we want to do this.state.decentralbank._address. And as for the amount, well, we want to approve the actual amount. So we can write amount for this, right? And after this, it's pretty much the same thing. We then just send it, right? We're just running the approval to do the exact same thing we're doing here. So what we want to do is .send all of this, including the open parentheses, and the sorry, the open, including adding the open curly bracket and the open parentheses. And to correctly close this now, we're going to need to add an extra curly bracket and parentheses here. So in order for this transaction to run, the approval transaction has to run first. And I have another mistake over here because we can't just get approve from nowhere. Approve has to come from this contract in our methods, right? So it's got to be this.state.tether.methods.approve. And deposit token also comes from methods, right? It's coming from Web3, so we're shooting in our methods. So we need to bring it in through our methods. And let's check to see that we're not running into anything crazy. Looks like there's nothing happening here. We're not really calling this yet, so. And finally, what we want to do is actually pass this function now over into our main component. Just like we've been passing over the state as properties, we want to now set up this function as a property so that our main component can use it. And to do that, it's quite simple. We can just bring in stake tokens, stoken token. I don't know what that means. Stake tokens equals this dot stake tokens, just like that. And now we're bringing in our stake token function. All right, and that's the code for our stake tokens. And just so you can see it, stake tokens. And maybe if I zoom out, you can see it a little bit better. Maybe this can help. But essentially what we're doing here, let's just go over it step by step one more time. Because if this is really confusing and you didn't understand anything we just did, don't worry, don't worry. There's a lot going on here. So let's just go over it step by step one more time. So we create a function called stake tokens. We have an arrow function here. Essentially, we set the state loading to true first because we want the loading to change to true until we've completed this. So therefore we keep loading. Therefore our loader will come up just in case. Our loader comes up first before we can execute this because we really want to grab all this information before the transactions happen, right? So then okay, so after we've got our loader running, what we want to do is we have to set up the approval first. We need to have the approval, remember, in order to actually deposit tokens as a third party from the central bank for Tether, because it's coming through these different contracts, and we're using in the deposit tokens the transfer from in order to do that. So the first thing we need to do is approve. So we run the approve, and the approve we set to the central bank address, right? Because it takes an address and an amount, and the amount is the input amount, right? And then that we just send from the account that we're doing it from. Well, not the account that we personally are doing it from, but from what the customer is doing, because you have to remember that it's the customer that will be staking these tokens, and it's going to be that account. And we already have that account in our state, so we can just use it like that. And then we run that transaction before we process this transaction. So that gets run, and then after that, we run the deposit token. And there, it's pretty much the same thing, right? It's pretty much the same thing. We're sending the amount from the state of this. We're sending the amount from this account. The amount is that we are depositing. That's the staking amount. So whatever we are staking, that amount from that account. And we run that transaction. And when we're finished, we switch the loading state back to false. And that's our stake token functionality. Whew. Wow, it's a lot of words. It's a mouthful. Even for me to just say it all sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is. But essentially, that's what it comes down to. So for your exercise, and this is a bonus exercise, if you're feeling brave, go ahead and write the unstake token function. Go ahead and try to write that arrow function and see if you can derive it. It's actually not so bad, but there's of course going to be a couple changes to be made here, right? Because we're not going to be using, here's a big hint, the deposit tokens, right? So go ahead and give that a shot. And in the next video, we're going to do the solution together. So if you have no idea how to do it, don't worry. We can just skip that and we can move on and take a look at it together. But even if you have no idea, why not just go ahead and give it a shot? You never know. Just writing stuff out, even when you're coming at it from a blank canvas, who knows what you can come up with. You know, sometimes giving yourself that extra push can take you to figuring out how this stuff works. Okay, excellent job. I'll see you in the next video.